This is bad, boss. I know. Seriously, this is. Shut up. The grey robe fell silent. Falagram crossed his arms silently, glowering at the evening shadows. They were in the middle of a forest, yet not a bird could be heard. He glanced over his shoulder to the obvious cause, two plate-armored undead nearly twice his height. Between them stood a human, of all things, dressed in one of the ridiculous outfits that their aristocrats were said to wear. If you feel like being a fucking flower, go and plant yourself in the mud. Falagram's frown deepened as she smiled at him. He turned and walked away, hocking a glob of spittle onto the carpet of needles blanketing the forest floor. His escort formed in the area nearby and he returned to his camp a kilometer up the valley to the north. As he approached the perimeter, two deep wardens appeared with crossbows at the ready. Falagram waved them away, walking by rows of cargo litters piled high with goods. Sentries and caravan workers alike wisely steered clear, sensing the storm brewing over their leader's head. After discovering that the goblin army they were supplying in the east had been destroyed, he turned his people around and headed straight for their next best prospect. Some demon emperor had appeared in the Abelian Hills and was raising an army out of the demi-humans there. An army needed equipment, he figured. He was right. Offering to equip Yaldabaoth's forces was the best business decision of his life. Through fall and winter, he delivered shipment after shipment month by month. Hundreds of thousands of demi-humans were outfitted for the Demon Emperor's campaign against the Holy Kingdom of Roble. Under Yaldabaoth's tyrannical rule, there was no shortage of slaves to trade for fine equipment forged in the deep mountain halls of the Dark Dwarves. With his latest shipment of goods, however, came an unpleasant surprise. Yaldabaoth had been defeated and the war for the Holy Kingdom had been lost. There was a new power in the neighborhood, the same power that the human and her two undead goons represented. The Sorceress Kingdom. Not that he cared who was in power. If he could deal with demons, he could deal with the undead. The problem was that there was no market for his goods and slavery was illegal in the Sorceress Kingdom. What sort of nutjob outlaws slavery? It didn't make a lick of sense. Everyone had slavery in one form or the other. Outlawing slavery didn't stop it. It only increased demand that others were more than happy to fill. Why did they even care? It was a kingdom of darkness that used undead, for crying out loud. Don't break the merchandise. I may as well, Falagram growled through his beard. Agni appeared from behind a stack of steel breastplates. She offered him a skewer of roast lizard. Falagram took the food with a sigh, tearing off a chunk and chewing his frustrations out. What happened? The cleric asked. War's over, Falagram answered. On top of that, the new people in charge don't trade in slaves. That's crazy, Agni frowned. You don't say? Sarcasm dripped from his voice, but crazy's what we have to deal with. There's a giant pile of scrap on our hands to get rid of. The cleric opened her mouth, then seemed to think better of what she was going to say. He was pretty sure he knew what it was, so it was a wise decision on her part. How can I turn this around? Falagram's trade brought dark dwarven goods, almost exclusively metalwork, out to the tribes of the Abelian Hills. In exchange, the tribes offered prisoners taken through their constant raiding and warfare. He took the slaves that he thought would sell well. The demi-humans ate the rest. It was a time-honored tradition that everyone respected. The merchants who supplied him with manufactured goods only dealt in slaves. They didn't need anything else. Of course, that also meant no refunds for any crap that he couldn't get rid of. Maybe we can take our stuff and sell it elsewhere, he muttered. Some other part of the Abelian Hills? Agni asked. According to the representative that I spoke to, Falagram answered, the Sorceress Kingdom's taken the whole area. The Sorceress Kingdom, that's a new one. Some new magocracy that's popped up? Name's too generic for anything old. An acropolis, more like. They had exactly one living person to talk to. No wonder they outlawed slavery. Aha. Seen one bunch of necromancers, seen 'em all. Where to then? East of the next no good. What about Avasha? Falagrim's sour expression soured even further. I ain't trading with no prissy ourselves. There were a dozen demi-human kingdoms in Avasha at last count. Even the closest one take till winter to reach, Falagram said. We don't have the provisions for that. Then trade some of our goods for provisions, Agni said. It's better than nothing. He tossed his wooden skewer into a nearby bush with an exasperated sigh. What sort of losses would he be facing by the end of everything? It would be over a year away from home on top of that. Even if he managed to keep things afloat, his future prospects looked grim. Agony was right, however. Before anything else, they had to unload their inventory, and Avasha was the best place to do it now that the Abelian Hills weren't an option. "Gather the merchants," Falagram said. "Tell them to put something together. Let's get this over with." 7th day, Lower Wind Month, 1 CE. "Welcome home, Lady Gonye." "I'm home." Florine offered a warm smile to the household of her family's ancestral manor, an old, cozy complex on the outskirts of Gonye Barony's largest village. It was a place that some claimed had been around for centuries, the current building sitting where its predecessors were before being destroyed during the demon god's rampage 2 centuries previous. She wasn't sure whether that claim was true, but it wouldn't be a surprise if it was. Villages, towns, and cities were where they were for a reason, so they naturally sprung up again even if something flattened them. House Gonye's ancestral seat was where it was because it had been built atop a river that flowed some 50 meters underground. It wasn't the only such locale. A long string of villages existed along the underground river's course where wells were built to tap into the water source. The river could also be reached through a small network of caves accessible through the catacombs of her family's mausoleum. When they were younger, Tiare, who had grown curious about where it went, summoned a water elemental to find out. According to her, the river went underground somewhere north of Kani village and emptied into the Katza River to the south. After leaving her things in the foyer with her lady's maid, Florine ascended the stairs to the second floor. Memories of her childhood followed her as she made her way down the familiar corridor and knocked on the entrance to the solar. "Lady Mother," she said. Seconds passed in silence. "Lady Mother? It's Florine. I'm back from my business abroad." A minute went by without a response before Florine opened the door. She found her mother sitting on a couch in the Solar's lounge, not 6 meters from the entrance. "Good afternoon, Lady Mother." Florine lowered her head in a respectful curtsy. Her mother didn't even spare a glance in her direction. Instead, she seemed entirely focused on an unfolded set of pristine white papers in her hand. "Did something happen?" Florine asked. "Nothing yet has happened," her mother muttered in response, then held up the papers in her hand. "A letter from my brother in Franklin. At least someone is worried about all of us caught in this hellhole." "It's not a hellhole, Lady Mother." She knew that refuting her mother's statement would lead nowhere, however. Florine could only smile sadly as her mother went on another of her tirades about how their home had been conquered by the forces of darkness. In a word, her mother had become unhinged. Perhaps unhinged was too strong of a word. She was still very much the talented and capable merchant's daughter who had married into House Gonye, and that was perhaps the most frightening part about it. Her mother wasn't insane or suffering the ravages of old age. Winona Eldale Gonye was merely 32 years of age and should have been at the peak of her life as a woman. Born to a prosperous merchant family and the city-state alliance, Florine's mother was spared no expense in her upbringing. She had the finest education and wanted for nothing. Between her beauty, talent, and the investment her family had made in her, she outmatched even the scions of high nobles, though the nobility would never admit it. When she reached adulthood, her mother was used for the purpose she was born and bred for, to forge blood ties with prospective allies. Merchants did not strategize the same way as nobles. Instead of aiming for the highest possible match by the measures of the aristocracy, they made the most commercially viable match. Her mother's family needed a foothold in the valuable crossroads of Irantal, and House Gonye, a merchant house with a stable reputation and known for being well-grounded in the ways of commerce, happened to be looking for a match for their heir. To Florine, it seemed a very cut-and-dry way to come into existence. She had even inherited her mother's beauty and both of her parents' aptitudes. Florine's mother wasted no time and spared no raising her daughter in the same manner as she had been, though Florine's father had objections over how ruthless his wife was about weaponizing their daughter. He was by far the softer of Florine's parents and would have preferred that she grow up in the more traditional manner that noble scions did and find a nice match who would truly cherish her. Neither her father's nor her mother's wishes would come to fruition, however, for the Battle of Katza Plains changed everything. Her father and 2 brothers didn't come back. By the laws of Riestis, which had been adopted by the Sorceress Kingdom, Mistress Florine was now Baroness Garnier. Her lady mother became the old Lady Garnier with no title to speak of, and her life at the forefront of Erantal's high society came to a calamitous end. Florine's mother didn't take it well at all, and Florine thought she could empathize. Up until that point, her mother's life had been perfect. She was born into a wealthy family, gifted with beauty, intellect and talent, and raised to rub shoulders with the elites of society. A vibrant flower in full bloom abruptly stomped on by a passing goat. Or maybe that should be a passing death knight? She didn't take well to the undead, either. No one did, at first, but she only spiraled ever further into a delusion crafted by a web of convenient rationalizations. Whenever an undead patrol passed by the manor, her mother would scurry into the family chapel and pray for the earth god to swallow them. Despite all evidence to the contrary, she believed that Erantal suffered under the heel of an evil overlord, and everything that she saw outside of Garnier Barony was simply an illusion or a facade. Only Garnier Barony remained relatively untouched by the grace of the gods and the faith of its inhabitants. Arguing with her mother didn't work. Trying to convince her that what she believed was not true only made her believe it more. Florine was always lauded for her charisma and diplomatic acumen, but it felt like hollow praise when she couldn't even help a member of her own family. "So, have you found a consort yet?" Her mother's spiel over the atrocious state of affairs in the Sorceress Kingdom gradually gave way to something that may have been even more unpleasant. "Not yet, Lady Mother," Florine replied. "I've been busy this entire time." "Busy, huh? Well, I can't order you to do anything, but you should know that you can't fool around forever. Please don't do this." "Who else will?" her mother snapped. "Certainly not that gear-headed friend of yours. Remember that all those lovers you've collected are just for training. I'm sure you're more than skilled enough to please any husband by now." In her mother's mind, Florine had an entire parade of partners. She always had at least 6 twined around her pinky, and they would each have a day of the week with her. On the 7th day, she would have them all at once. Her mother actively encouraged this, though Florine always said that no such thing was happening, stating that being skilled at lovemaking was an invaluable tool. She had done the same thing when she was young, after all. When Florine spoke of how their faith valued chastity, her mother scoffed and said that it was a rule for the poor so they wouldn't breed like Bunya and overrun the countryside. An intelligent, well-bred woman decided with whom and when she would be bred. The whole thing about Florine's army of lovers was yet another symptom of her mother's condition. Her perfect life had been derailed, yet pieces of it still played out in her head. Florine eyed the half-folded papers still in her mother's fingers. "Lady Mother," she said. "It's been a while since you've last seen your family in Franklin. Uncle Francis always sends you those letters. Perhaps it would be a good idea to pay him a visit. While you're there, you could also see how our preparations to expand further into the Great Steppe are coming along. All we've had are reports to go by, after all." "I doubt my brother is available for any visit," Florine's mother said. "Always on the move, that one. And rightly so. He has to drive the family companies to greater heights while he still has the energy." She was right in that Uncle Francis being around to visit was highly improbable, but it was an excuse that she had used since her husband was still alive. "Maybe I could convince Uncle Francis to come here, instead." A part of Florine believed that her mother wouldn't listen to her because she would always see Florine as her child. Similarly, it wasn't the place of the household staff to oppose her in anything. Maybe she would listen to the elder brother whom she respected. "Florine?" Lady Sheltier's voice sounded in her head. Florine raised a hand to her ear. "Yes, my lady? I saw Ludmilla beating up adventurers in the Central District. Does that mean you're back from the Draconic Kingdom, as well?" "I just arrived in my domain. Is there something I might help you with?" "There are a few things I can think of, but there's no time for any of them. Albedo told me to send you her way once you arrived in Erantal." The Prime Minister wanted to see her? Clara had already gone to deliver her reports, but maybe there was something that needed clarification. Florine eyed her mother, who had returned her attention to Uncle Francis' letter. A dark portal appearing in her solar would probably feed her delusions even more. "May I have 5 minutes to sort out my things, my lady?" "Of course." The message spell ended. Florine lowered her head. "It seems that I have business in the capital, Lady Mother. I'm sorry I couldn't visit for long." I'll come by again when I have the time. Her mother absently waved her away. Florine didn't linger, letting out a quiet sigh once she was back in the corridor. She looked down at her shadow as she made her way to her room. What do you think I should do? A pair of glowing amber eyes appeared in the darkness, but the shadow demon didn't seem to have anything to say. Given that she spent every hour of every day with it, she supposed that it was the closest thing to a lover that she had. At first, Florine feared for her mother's life whenever she went on about the state of the Sorceress Kingdom, but the shadow demon didn't seem to care. If it reported anything to Lady Sheltier, nothing had come out of it. "Tiare, are you ready to go?" "Yes, my lady." Her lady's maid came out of Florine's old bedroom. "Lady Sheltier will be gating us to Erantle," Florine said. "Could you inform our carriage?" Once, they hadn't, which was more than a bit awkward. Fortunately, Soul Eaters got around quickly. Lady Sheltier's gate appeared in the manor foyer exactly 5 minutes from the end of her message. Florine stepped through with Tiare, and they appeared in the teleportation gazebo in Erantle's central district. A light breeze delivered cool air from the Frost Dragon Aviary to the north, driving away the heat of the sun-baked city streets. Lady Sheltier stood on the lane before them, shaded by her parasol. 2 vampire brides in their regular garb attended her to either side. "Good afternoon, Lady Sheltier," Florine lowered her head in a curtsy. "Good afternoon," Lady Sheltier replied. "Before you ask, I have no idea what this is about." "I see." In other words, Lady Albedo wanted to see Florine about something that wasn't explicitly related to Lady Sheltier's duties. The most likely reason was some matter related to Florine's work with the various member tribes of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Lady Albedo also did socialize once in a while, but, for nobles, socializing was mostly a venue for private business, and Lady Albedo seemed no different in that regard. "Tiare," Florine said, "go ahead and drop our things off. I'll let you know how long I'll be once I find out." "Yes, my lady." Her lady's maid lowered her head to Florine and Lady Sheltier before going on her way. Another gate opened in the gazebo. "Are we going elsewhere, my lady?" Florine asked. No. Albedo's in the royal villa." "You're not coming with me?" "No, you're not planning on running away or something, are you?" "Of course not, my lady." "In that case, have fun with whatever boring thing that Gorilla has come up with." With that, Lady Sheltier and her vampire brides left Florine all alone by the gazebo. On the way to the royal villa, Florine mused over how different Lady Sheltier was once she considered someone an insider. While her haughty, aristocratic demeanor was still present, she also became just as casual as Leanne was around her friends. She asked a Death Knight at the villa entrance to guide her to the Prime Minister. It led her down the familiar route to the Great Hall. Within the softly lit chambers of the royal court, Florine found Lady Albedo working at her desk at the right side of the Sorcerer King's vacant throne. The Prime Minister did not look up from her work as Florine approached. "Your Excellency," Florine lowered her head. "I have a new duty for you," Lady Albedo said. "Are there any materials to study?" Florine asked. A stack of 3 brown binders was placed between them. Florine picked one up and opened the cover. "The Abelian Special Administrative Area." She flipped past the front page, finding an 11-page index behind it. The contents appeared to be slightly modified versions of the reports Florine had put together when she was working with the tribes in the forests around the Azalisia Mountains. In addition, Lady Albedo had slipped in various notes, objectives and questions between the pages. "This will take me a while to read through," Florine said. "I've never even heard of 2/3 of the races listed in this index." "Time should be the least of your concerns," the Prime Minister told her. "Ensure that your work in the Abelian wilderness is at least at the standard of your work with the tribal territories in the north." Florine nodded, flipping through to some of the races that she was familiar with. While the project seemed ambitious as a whole, each component was relatively simple. Much like the tribes she had already worked with, the people in the Abelian wilderness didn't have much in the way of industry, and most weren't even sedentary. "No, it looks like they're even less sedentary than the demi-humans I'm familiar with." She flipped through the pages until she reached one of the maps of the area, frowning at what she saw. "Are these boundaries recent?" Florine asked. "The area was conquered by Demon Emperor Yaldabaoth," Lady Albedo told her, and the most warlike races were assembled to invade the Holy Kingdom of Roble. The map only depicts the surviving populations liberated by His Majesty, but what we know of the missing races and tribes has been included just in case you find them necessary. Florian continued examining the map as Lady Albedo offered the non-answer. Many would have accepted it as an explanation, but it didn't actually answer her real question, which was why there were lines on the map at all. One of the first things Florine learned when she went to help out in the Great Forest of Tob was that lines such as the ones drawn on the map in the binder didn't exist. Every tribe, magical beast, solitary heteromorph, and monster had a territory that was better defined as a range, and the extent of that range was flexible. Furthermore, one did not necessarily start where another stopped. The lines on the map were probably drawn by the Sorceress Kingdom's administration, perhaps by a freshly assigned Elder Lich who didn't know any better. Florine looked up from the map. "Are these boundaries set in stone, Your Excellency?" Lady Albedo's amber gaze seemed to glow at her question. "You may redefine the map as you see fit," the Prime Minister said, "but be sure to provide the same level of documentation as your work with the tribes in the north. The servitors assigned to the area may need those references in the future." "In that case," Florine said, "is there anything that needs to stay as it is?" "Literally, no. The highway between the upper reaches of the Katsa Basin and the Holy Kingdom of Roble is currently under construction and must be accounted for. The buffer zone between the Abelian wilderness and the surrounding countries must also be respected." "Does this apply to Roble's citizens, as well?" "Yes. While their country may be on good terms with the Sorceress Kingdom diplomatically, any challenge to His Majesty's order will be answered to the full extent of the law." That was to be expected. Lady Albedo was just as austere as Ludmilla was, and far more ruthless when it came to doling out justice. "And how have the laws of the Sorceress Kingdom been applied to this new area?" Florine asked. "For now," Lady Albedo answered, "the bare minimum to stay in line with our foreign policy. Domestically speaking, you know as well as I how things are." "Yes, Your Excellency." The Sorceress Kingdom had adopted the laws of Rhystis as a starting point for its government, and it still required extensive amendment. Lady Albedo had spent the past year eliminating loopholes, addressing blind spots, and adding clauses to legislation to account for its many different citizens, but the laws of the Sorceress Kingdom were still fundamentally laws for human governance. Blindly applying human laws to non-human populations was foolish to the extreme, but creating viable laws for the Sorceress Kingdom grew more complex with every new member race. As such, there were a number of provisional laws, essentially a list of do's and don'ts put in place while lawmakers tried to puzzle out legislation that would work universally. That the Abelian wilderness was designated as a special administrative area suggested that it may very well be impossible. "Your Excellency, who is overseeing the special administrative area at the moment?" "A few elder liches have been placed on standby at the Department of Transportation's staging area." "Staging area?" "The provisional laws have been implemented and we've been provisioning the population since His Majesty liberated the area." "How many people are we feeding?" "The latest estimates place the number of obligate carnivores at 800,000. Florine's lips immediately turned downward. "That's not going to work," she said. "Trade and domestic production weren't even keeping up with the existing population before this. It was a problem that they were running into everywhere. The tribes of carnivorous demi-humans that found themselves under the Sorcerer King's rule usually fed on one another when their regular food sources grew scarce. Crown laws, however, prohibited the Sorceress Kingdom's subjects from eating one another without local administrators with the right to create bylaws making an exception. Additionally, His Majesty the Sorcerer King promised security and prosperity to all who submitted to his reign, and his government was obliged to make it happen. But, with nothing to keep their population in check, it was inevitable that their dietary demands would eventually exceed the region's capability to meet them. "The issue has been alleviated for the time being," Lady Albedo told her. "The population of the Abelian Hills will be redistributed to the rest of the wilderness." "But what about the people who already live in that wilderness?" Florine asked. The impact of Yaldabaoth's activities wasn't limited to Roble. Many tribes fled from the Abelian Hills, creating a wave of conflict that depopulated the lands in every direction. "That's terrible." Lady Albedo snorted at Florine's distress. "For them, perhaps," she said. "For us, it is a convenience that we will take full advantage of before others do." Your task is to set them on the path to achieving the bare minimum per capita production required of the Sorceress Kingdom's carnivorous population. She still had no idea how Lady Albedo had arrived at that number or how she could guarantee that the Sorceress Kingdom could provide for its citizens at that rate. It was treated as reliable enough to somehow work on credit, but the burdens that it put on the Sorceress Kingdom's logistics made it an undesirable measure. This was especially the case in the Abelian Hills, where there was little in the way of infrastructure. It was no small wonder that Lady Shiltir rarely showed her face after the conflict in the Holy Kingdom came to an end. She was probably stuck transporting food via gate every day. In that case, Florine said, I should familiarize myself with everything and see if there are any viable avenues to pursue. I will maintain regular correspondence via Elder Lich, Your Excellency. She closed the binder and placed it in her infinite haversack, then reached out for the next. To her surprise, Lady Albedo didn't return her attention to her paperwork. By the way, Lady Albedo said, have you made any progress with that item? No, Your Excellency, Florine replied. I've activated it and kept it with me at all times, but there's no visible sign of change. Oh, speaking of which, I'm not sure whether you were angry about what I said that day, but I would like to apologize once again if so. I would have been angry if you hadn't spoken as you did, the Prime Minister replied. You were granted that item because your capabilities merit us keeping you, not because you excel at exaggerating your worth, currying favor, groveling, or cowering in fear. The Prime Minister's lip curled in a disdainful sneer at some unknown memory. I've had more than my fill of that sort recently, Lady Albedo said, and I would like for nothing more than to be rid of them. You would do well to remember that you are no longer a part of some ludicrous human nation, Baroness Gonye. The servants of the Sorcerer King serve His Majesty with absolute loyalty. The royal court will never censure you for your words or actions so long as it is understood that you are doing so in genuine service to the Supreme One. My lady, Tiare lowered her head before Florine at the entrance of the royal villa. I'm sorry, Florine said. I didn't get a chance to ask how long we would be. How are things at home? In one piece, her lady's maid replied, for now. Lady Wagner came calling, followed by Lady Corlin. I took the liberty of having dinner prepared. Thanks, Florine smiled. When will everything be ready? 3 hours, Tiare replied. Lady Corlin and Lady Wagner decided to wander around while they waited. That sounded like Leanne's doing. Since it was their first day back from the Draconic Kingdom, she probably thought that they had some free time to enjoy themselves with. As it was proven, however, idle hands were immediately put back to work again by the royal court. Well, they wouldn't begrudge us dinner, would they? Probably not. Lady Shiltir always made sure to unwind once in a while, and she mentioned that the Sorcerer King encouraged them to do so. Florine made her way up the central promenade, taking the sights of the late afternoon. The blossoms of spring had long given way to rows of verdant greenery over the sun-baked pavement. As usual, the central district was mostly frequented by people crossing between the northern and southern ends of Irantal. Some stopped at the Adventurer Guild's exhibition hall, occasionally cheering or groaning in response to whatever was happening inside. As they made their way by, the crowd suddenly parted. Florine let out a small squeak as an adventurer flew out of the pit and landed on the pavement. Whispers rose from the crowd. No way, is that possible? They're both Mithril, aren't they? I'm pretty sure he blocked that attack. I didn't hear her use any martial arts. The adventurer on the pavement groaned and pushed himself up to his hands and knees. He shook his head of loose blonde locks, and then his gaze rose to meet Florine's. No, it stopped before that. A cute, but silly, smile appeared on his face. Florine maintained a neutral expression as the collective ire of more than a dozen women in the crowd stabbed into her. Henrich, Ludmilla's voice called from inside the hall, are you finished? Nope, the adventurer on the pavement wobbled to his feet. Let's try this again. Henrich turned and took 3 steps toward the open hall before falling in head first. Chuckles rose from the assembled adventurers. That's it for me today, Ludmilla said. Mochnich, do you know if the guildmaster wanted to speak to me about anything? Something about a training expedition when you got back, a broad-shouldered swordsman across the hall from her said. Actually, I think you're the one that brought it up in the first place. Ah, that's right. We keep digging things up while constructing the new highway. The construction crews have been storing away whatever they find, but I'm certain that they haven't been any but the most obvious of artifacts. What do they look like? Mochnich asked. Sections of an old, buried highway, Ludmilla answered. But something like that should have settlements along it. I figured that it needs to be looked at before something of important historical significance gets destroyed. Sounds like just the thing we've signed up for, the adventurer said. Is it dangerous out there? Only as dangerous as you make it, Ludmilla smiled. I need to speak with Eintzak about the rules out there before he puts the expedition together. There are rules? There are always rules no matter where one finds themselves, Ludmilla told him, whether one knows about them or not. Ludmilla placed the practice spear in her hand in a nearby weapon rack before climbing the stairs out of the exhibition hall. Florine smiled and waved as her friend came around the corner of the street with Amelia. Did Liane speak with you? Florine asked. Yes, Ludmilla said. Something about dinner and shopping, though I suspect that she has something planned. I'm sorry if we've interrupted anything. It's fine. Ludmilla fell in step beside her as they made their way toward the southern gate. This isn't something that will be resolved anytime soon. Resolved? Florine looked up at Ludmilla. Is there some problem? An issue of development. It would be better to say it involves a lapse in development. Florine looked around. She didn't see anyone in particular that Ludmilla might not want listening into their conversation, so it probably had to do with all the strange things they learned about the world from the Sorcerer's Kingdom. The idea that knowledge could be dangerous was something every noble knew, but a whole new dimension was added to that danger when it came to what they learned. Is it something that would concern all of us? Definitely. The basic idea is simple. These class levels, we've been made aware of them, but we still frame them in familiar ways. As a society, we've constructed a common perception that attempts to interpret the world around us. Some, we've come up with on our own. Others are ideas imported from elsewhere. Ludmilla's voice had the telltale tone that she took whenever she was trying to construct understandable thoughts out of her intuition. Clara would be a better person to help walk her through it, but she must have brought it up with Florine for a specific reason. We can hardly be blamed for that. That is how we make sense of the world around us. I'm not exactly blaming us for that. The problem is that we've come to see that perception as natural or common sense, and that very thinking blocks us from realizing the full potential of what we have. An artisan who is recognized as a master by their guild merely has 3 or 4 job class levels in their vocational path. That designation is not qualified by the peak of the craft, but through meeting an acceptable standard of craftsmanship for common goods. It also doesn't define any skills or abilities along the way. All of the special things that people discover or develop through their job classes are either not recognized as such or considered a trade secret, and those involved in trades probably have things the easiest because they at least have guild standards to go by. What vocation would you say suffers the most by comparison? Anything that functions off of intangibles, really. You're probably one of the best examples. Why do I feel like everyone's been singling me out recently? I'm not sure if you've noticed, but the entire royal court has combat builds. They don't care about how strong anyone is, but people like you have outsized value. Why, did something else happen? Lady Albedo wants me to work with the tribes in the Abelian Hills. Actually, I'd like to confer with you on several topics before I head over there. Yotilda. Liane and Clara appeared at the intersection in front of the southern gate. The two were dressed for a casual stroll in the city with their ladies' maids in tow, but no footmen. Ever since they received their equipment from Lady Shiltier, they didn't need extra hands while shopping, and the undead around the city made things secure enough to walk around as they were. Where are we going? Florine asked. Around, Liane answered. Around to where? Florine peered at her. Around to the perfumed quarter. Florine rolled her eyes. Her friend had an objective, after all. They made their way out of the southern gate and into the common area of the city, joining the flow of pedestrian traffic along the northern edge of the road. She couldn't help but make comparisons between Erantal and the cities of both the Empire and the Draconic Kingdom. Given all of the apparent advantages that the Sorcerer's Kingdom had, Erantal being a former city of Reestais wouldn't hold up as an excuse for their capital's appearance for long. As far as changes went, there was only the demi-human quarter and some road work. Given the future growth projected for the Sorcerer's Kingdom, there was a lot that needed to be done beyond fixing the city's appearance. They needed new infrastructure to support the population. Most of the common area would need to be torn down and reworked into an efficient urban layout. The military quarter needed to be converted into something else, but that was still in committee. It was obvious what they had to do, however. Rantal's second wall had to come down. It was useless, anyway, and the common area expanded to the outer wall. So, did Lady Albedo spank ya? Of course not. Figures. You ain't limping or anything. What did she want? I'm being dispatched to the Abelian wilderness. Ah, so another hapless group of demi-humans is about to get ruthlessly boobed. Florian gave Leanne a swat. You're not coming with me, just so you know. I got a bunch of stuff to do too, so I can't come anyway. I guess you have a lot of orders from the Holy Kingdom now that they're on good terms with us. Nope. Haven't heard a peep from them, which is weird. We're getting ready for all of those nobles from the Empire. I totally forgot about that. Arg. The first party from the Empire was due to arrive in Corlin Castle at the beginning of summer, and they would be arriving through to the beginning of the autumn harvest. She wouldn't be able to attend if she was busy helping out in the Abelian wilderness. Her duties would be dragging her away from a season filled with golden opportunities. Don't worry, I got you covered. Just don't marry me off. Yeah, no, I hadn't considered that until you mentioned it. She probably wouldn't do it. Still, the idea that a potential consort might pop up at any time during their negotiations only made the fact that Florian wouldn't be there hurt even more. Anyway, that thing we were talking about? Leanne rolled her eyes at Ludmilla's pointed change of topic. She and Clara was still adamant about them being too young to have consorts. There was little point in arguing about it, however, and it wasn't as if they could do anything about it anyway. Yes, where were you going with that? Something about intangibles. That's right. Vocations that function according to intangible aspects are probably the worst off when it comes to how our society and its institutions develop them. Society values them, but there are no real metrics that define how success in those fields is achieved. Florian is a good example of it. Diplomacy is by and large an arena for aristocrats and other types of leaders in the region, but our training as nobles in that field is rather vague. We learn history, language, etiquette and all of the other things that go into successful diplomacy, but we don't learn diplomacy itself. Clara and Leanne frowned and exchanged a look. Ludmilla sighed. Florian held in her smile. She was already pretty sure she knew what Ludmilla was getting at, but it would take something tangible to make it click with them, which she supposed was the crux of the issue. Clara took Ludmilla's arm in hers. As you've mentioned, all of those subjects are crucial to conducting diplomacy. They're not. They're not? What's crucial is having information to work with. We were raised in an exclusively human society. All of those subjects bundled together are conflated with diplomacy because they provide the information to conduct diplomacy within our cultural sphere. I was raised with one foot outside of that human-centric worldview because the most crucial diplomacy that House Saradnik conducted wasn't with humans, but with the tribes beyond the border. What goes into their diplomacy doesn't have the same focus as what goes into human diplomacy, and House Saradnik's diplomacy is markedly different as a result. Clara furrowed her brow. Are you saying that I have to revise the curriculum for the academy again? Yes, but that wasn't the main point. There is a core to diplomacy, but no one teaches it as far as I know. Do you understand what I'm getting at? No. No. Yes. Leanne and Clara peered across Ludmilla at Florian. Florian pondered how she could convey an effective explanation. Before we reached you, Ludmilla prefaced this by bringing up job classes and how our society constructs its own common sense out of the systems that the Sorceress Kingdom has made us aware of. This isn't just about diplomacy, but an entire group of vocations that don't have concrete aspects to them. What we might consider social job classes, or at least those with social aspects to them. Leanne, consider how we're communicating right now. Is it common sense? No. But does it make sense to us? Yes. Why? Because we're nobles, and nobles are human lords. Us civilian nobles might not be heavy on the military end of things, but we still have oratory ability and make use of it. Nobles are also the go-to diplomats for similar reasons. It's just a part of our skill set. Then what makes a noble a good diplomat? It can't be education or anything that people might rationalize if it was diplomacy between human parties. When I worked with the northern tribes, I wasn't trying to outsmart anyone, threaten them, or trick them into doing what I wanted. Boobs. Florine raised a fist. Leanne raised her hands disarmingly. You're just built that way, okay? No one else even considered offering to help with those tribes. Are you saying that anyone with the same idea could succeed? No, they would have probably been eaten. Grr, I hate it when you two come up with an incomplete concept and fling it at us. That's just how it works, isn't it? People don't just know everything about something the moment they realize that it exists. In that case, could you tell us why you think it's important, Ludmilla? Because class levels start as empty containers. Ah, that's true. Their discussions with Lady Sheltia, Lady Aura, and Lord Mayor about job classes and their capabilities often left the royal courtiers both confused and somewhat frustrated. To them, a job class came with a long list of things that they could do, but the people of the region barely manifested anything that counted as a skill or ability when it came to civilian vocations. The container that Ludmilla referred to represented several things. First were the raw physical increases that gaining a job or racial class level conferred. Secondly, it included the raw boost in ability that required no training to harness. The empty part was the potential to develop skills and abilities related to that class level, and the power of those skills and abilities was limited to the capacity of the container. As it was, the vast majority of people in the region lived their lives as empty containers. Even highly educated nobles essentially beat one another over the head with those empty containers when conducting diplomatic negotiations or participating in court politics. Clara, too, seemed to catch on to what Ludmilla was implying. In hindsight, it seems obvious, but what brought this about in the first place? The campaign against the Beastmen? No, from the entire experience in the Draconic Kingdom. There are people out there who are capable of doing far more with far less. And when a truly powerful individual who isn't an empty container appears, the difference is stark. As a captain, I can't afford to leave the container empty, and the education of the Sorceress Kingdom's officials similarly can't produce well-crafted, yet empty, containers. I understand where you're coming from, but filling containers will require approval from the royal court. Ludmilla glanced at Clara, a crease forming on her brow. Knowledge can be dangerous, but raising officials who are ill-equipped to fight their battles is even more so. That's what I told Lady Albedo, but she simply replied that it is His Majesty's will. Since that was the case, it also meant that Director Alpha wouldn't be an ally in trying to convince the royal court of its necessity. Ludmilla, however, didn't appear convinced, which was strange considering how she usually upheld the Sorcerer King's edicts with unfaltering resolve. There should be more to that statement. If there is, she didn't mention it. We're here. Florine took an inventory of their surroundings at Leanne's announcement. She had been so engrossed in the conversation that she wasn't sure where in the city she was, at first glance. I heard this place blew up, she remarked. It did, Leanne said. Then Ludmilla swooped in to snatch up poor Miss Linez. You don't have to make it sound so predatory, Ludmilla sniffed. Tell me you didn't tempt her with your offer in her moment of weakness. It was the same offer I made a dozen times before. Aha. Sure. It looked like the damage to Atelier Linez was severe enough to warrant a new building. Unlike the other structures on the street, it was now constructed entirely out of granite. The bell over the door chimed as they entered and she found the interior pleasantly cool despite the late afternoon sun beating down on the storefront. A sandy-haired woman in a clerk's outfit looked up from the counter at the back of the store. Are you here to pick Baroness Saradnik and? The clerk's eyes widened. Having two countesses and two baronesses walk in probably wasn't a common occurrence. If there was one thing that hadn't changed in Erantle from before it changed hands, it was how different classes of people acted around one another. I've come to. Ludmilla paused. Actually, I have no idea why we're here. To check out your stuff, Leanne said. There wasn't much stuff to speak of. In fact, it looked like the store's inventory had been wiped out. Feel free, I suppose? Ludmilla said. Leanne gave Ludmilla a long, hard look. After a moment, she sighed. The point is that there's no stuff, Leanne gestured around at the empty shelves. Is that a problem? Ludmilla asked. You yourself noted the high demand for the magic items we've been exporting. I did, Leanne said, but it's not as if people die if they don't get it. Do you know why your shop is empty? Ludmilla only stared blankly at her question. Because I bought it, Leanne shouted. You? Why? Because it was cheap. An oppressive air descended on the store. The clerk fainted. Leanne turned and ran, but she only made it 1/10 of a step before Ludmilla's hand shot out to grab her arm. It was affordably priced, Ludmilla told her. It was stupidly priced. Leanne's hand kept phasing through Ludmilla's wrist. The point is improving the people's quality of life, Ludmilla said. Not maximizing profit. Nuh-uh, Leanne turned back around. That ain't how it works. If it's cheap, someone will buy it because it's free money. Do you have any idea how much those sold for in our winter? All those citizens you expect to walk into your store and benefit from your products will never see them because there'll always be that guy waiting to ambush your shipments to resell elsewhere. Ludmilla stormed past Leanne and left the store. Clara walked out after her. There must have been a better way to bring that up, Florine said. I was trying to prove a point, Leanne replied. There's something wrong with that woman's head. The market decides what things are worth. Anyone that offers their stuff below market value is just cheating themselves. Florine could understand Leanne's anger, but she was also fairly certain Ludmilla wouldn't. 5 minutes later, they caught up to Clara and Ludmilla on the way back to the Central District. So, Leanne said. You gonna fix your prices? They are fixed. That's not what I meant. Are you allergic to money or something? Why does it have to be about money at all? Ludmilla grated. Have you perhaps considered that profit is not my motive? Nope. But, like I said, if you don't profit, someone will profit off of your lack of profit motive. Then I'll just have to prevent that. They walked for a full block in silence, going past the row of boutiques southeast of the perfumed quarter. As they were crossing in front of one of the more popular shops, Ludmilla stopped. Why do you think this shop does so well? She asked. Because they have nice stuff, Leanne answered. And? A good reputation, pleasant staff, decent marketing. Why does it have to market its goods? Are these questions going anywhere? Leanne asked back. The answer is that it has to market its goods because people don't need them. Huh? Ludmilla resumed walking. You're the merchant, she said. You're all merchants. You should be smart enough to know what that means. Have you had this argument before? Leanne sent Clara a sidelong glance. Never, Clara replied. What's this about, Ludmilla? It's about why my products are priced as they are and why that boutique has to market its goods. That boutique's marketing tries to tell people that they aren't content with their lives and that they need the luxuries it offers to achieve happiness. What's wrong with having a few luxuries? Leanne asked. Very little right now, Ludmilla answered. But this marketing never ends. The success of that business and others like it requires that people are perpetually convinced that they're unhappy with what luxuries they have and that happiness will be achieved by obtaining the next luxury. Do you not see the flaws inherent to that strategy? Just so you know, those magic items you're selling are also a luxury. They crossed back into the Central District, turning east at the first intersection. It was still too early for dinner, but Ludmilla seemed intent on dragging them back to Florine's place. They're not luxuries, Ludmilla said. They're essential. The projections for population growth in the Sorceress Kingdom are catastrophic. Every household not using a magic item for heating, cooking and lighting will be burning firewood. Anyone not using magic items to preserve food will be losing it to spoilage. All of those goods being consumed come from somewhere. Everything that Atelier Lyonnaise sells is an attempt to mitigate the problems looming in our future, and equipping every household in the Sorceress Kingdom with those items is a priority. This is that tree hugger faction thing, isn't it? Call it what you will, but those are the facts. The basic needs of our future population are already high enough, having industries that depend on convincing people that luxuries are needs and that those needs must be regularly replaced by other needs according to some profit motive exacerbates the problem exponentially. It's even worse when one considers the fact that their marketing aggressively preys on instincts that the vast majority of the population either can't or won't voluntarily rein in. Florine's footman bowed as she and her friends entered her city manor. Never mind dinner not being quite ready, it didn't even smell like anything was cooking yet. They settled around the drawing room table, though Ludmilla looked anything but. You were never so heated about this subject before, Clara said. Did something happen? Probably because over the last half a year, Ludmilla said, I've been exposed to a long string of problems that are all directly related to overpopulation. The projections made by the royal court are simply numbers on a report. There is no sense of urgency or even the appropriate imagination amongst our lawmakers to grasp what sort of problems it will bring. The empire expands its frontiers because of the needs of its population. That entire escapade with the beastmen in the Draconic Kingdom was fundamentally due to the same needs. Unless we do something about it, our country is going to go through the same thing, but, unlike migrating tribes or the empire, no one will be able to stop us. I don't see anything wrong with that, Leanne yawned and stretched. And I'm sure that the royal court will be ecstatic with the Sorceress Kingdom's growing tax revenues. Florine's head turned as she looked back and forth between Leanne and Ludmilla. For the time being, it appeared that their stances were irreconcilable. She herself wasn't sure where she stood on the matter, but she dreaded that a day might arrive when their differences would come to a head.